Early exchange, shaping policy, advancing development.
Has begun to shape policies regarding health, because this morning health is our focus. As you know, the show has two anchors, you could say brother and sister, helping to shape policies. So Iron Blessing AG and Temple Barra from the core TC Barra is in the studio this morning and want to talk health. First, there are two stories around health that interest me, and I know interest you as well. One of them is the Abidjan Declaration when it comes to immunization, like charting the future for sustainable immunization in Africa. And the other, the report saying that malaria has, the rate of malaria infections has declined by 20%. I don't know what you think of that, because when you look around, you see the environment, and you think of what constitutes a breeding ground for mosquitoes that actually cause the malaria disease. You want to look at that again. But before we get into the malaria thing, talking about immunization, ensuring that diseases that are preventable, children from early age are immunized against it. And this time, ensuring that declaration is ensuring that Africa takes a pivotal stand and sits against what could actually hinder the health and development of children by sponsoring majorly immunization.
Well, I'll start off by saying good morning and good SOUQ. That's how you say it.
Oh, yes, good SOUQ, good Nigeria.
Good Nigeria to you right here. And well, looking at that report, talking about the immunization report, for a long time, Africa has depended on the West for aids, for relief materials, for medical assistance, and of course, knowledge and technology. The dependency sometimes is troubling in as much as it's also appreciated, right? But then the Abidjan Declaration has nine African countries coming together. That feels like a regional bloc, maybe part of ECOWAS, the economic community coming together to have such a declaration or an agreement. And it just speaks a lot about the state of affairs in Africa. ECOWAS, some countries pulling out because of political tensions and military takeover, right, which has been orchestrated by coup plots in those nations. And then the Organization of African Unity, which used to be a big deal, late 90s, right, early 2000, seems like it has gone into somewhat comatose. Now, we've seen countries just like, England pulling out of the European Union, the Brexit, feeling that they can stand by themselves. When, there's this maxim that says, together everyone achieves more. Loosening or relaxing border policies that affect cross-border businesses and all that, could also go a long way in also enhancing some of the arrangements or what you call collaboration between different countries. So I have a problem with the fact that that declaration, albeit, good, right? I can't find the right words for lack of words to describe how I feel about it, is only an agreement between 9 persons or amongst 9 persons.
9 countries.
When we have lots of other countries in Africa who can contribute and also benefit from such an agreement. So maybe when we get into the meat of the matter, discuss with our guests or analysts, as the case may be, because today we'll be speaking with a doctor who is the Executive Secretary of the Nigerian Academy of Science and also a former chairman of the Lagos State Chapter of Association of Public Health Physicians of Nigeria. We'll probably pick his brain.
Yes,
yeah, find out what he
intend to do that.
Yeah.
And as someone who's in the field, tell us what it's like, what the level of progress has been so far in terms of immunization, because there are also have also been reports of insufficient immunization. The vaccines for immunization being insufficient.
Injectables and all
yes, particularly in some areas, and so it's a struggle really. But let's see whether that story would change. The narrative will become different when the 9 countries, the 9 ministers of health that were present at that Abidjan meeting, when African countries begin to take ownership of this, it will improve as to when the vaccines were supplied, sometimes by aids from developed countries. So we have a guest who's ready to talk with us this morning. As Temple has told you, we will pick his brain. Oh, yes. But we know that his brain is quite large, so we can't pick all of it. But we'll do as much as we can. So Dr. Oladoyin Odubanjo is joining us virtually this morning. Thank you for joining in. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
All right, you must have had a conversation, but let's bring it to you now. When it comes to immunization, let's understand first what it does and how it has helped so far.
Well, basically, immunization, of course, is a way to ensure that when children are born, they are immediately protected. Actually, it's not just children. We have adult immunization, which was made a reality with COVID-19 in more recent times. But generally, it's associated with children, and it's to ensure that when children are born, we actually can ensure their survival, both in terms of life itself, but also in terms of quality of life, so they can live, survive the early years, and they can live well without any disability, like we associate with a disease like polio, for instance. So there are other diseases that could easily take their lives, tuberculosis, measles. So you want to, and they're called vaccine preventable diseases, meaning that we can actually prevent these things happening, and that's the value of immunization. But beyond that value of living long and living well is the value economically that it brings, because disease and debilitation ensures that you lose economically. That's the side of it that most people don't think about. Policymakers don't also think about it very much, because you think in terms of health, we're going to spend money on vaccines. This health, people are asking me, the health minister, the health commissioner is asking me to devote X millions, to vaccination. And you're thinking, look, I have other problems to solve, and we have the economy to deal with. But then we forget that these are the people who are going to contribute to the development of your economy. So if those people, for instance, are not in good health and do not achieve optimum development, so when a child is inhibited by disease and doesn't develop well as he should, he becomes a burden to society. So instead of contributing to that society economically, he becomes a burden that the society will have to take care of one way or the other. That could be because the government has facilities to take care of people with disability who are unable to take care of themselves, or other members of that person's family will have to devote time, which they could have spent, in economic activities. They will have to devote that time to taking care of this child much more than they should have. So that's the benefit of vaccination, is that vaccination ensures that at the end of the day, everybody lives long and everybody lives well. Thank you.
Well, it's obvious that the dependence on the West, or relying on the West for funding vaccine and providing what is needed, to ensure that we have immunization in the continent of Africa, would have had some negative impact, especially trying to pull out now with this Abidjan Declaration. But then you've mentioned the issue of funding in your narration there, talking about, probably the Minister of Health asking for more funds to, process the immunization project, and there's a dependence, or there's a need to shift focus to the economy and all of that. What are the challenges, do you think might come with a transitioning to self-funding of immunization project in Nigeria and Africa?
Well, if you're going to transition, it's almost like we are dealing with oil. If you're going to transition to total independence, then you also have to ask yourself a few more questions. And I think the Abidjan Declaration does identify those things. It means, number one, you're not getting any subsidy, as it were. I'm using that word because we're very familiar with that word in Nigeria. So what was happening is that your payments for vaccines were being subsidized by what is known as Gavi, which is a global agency. Uh, but when you say you want self-sufficiency, then you're saying, hey, don't give us any more subsidy. We are going to pay for it all by ourselves. Of course, immediately, uh, say, for instance, in Nigeria, as it were, you'll have to ask yourself, if you are going to pay for it all by ourselves, where would the money come from? We're already looking for money for so many things. We're fighting over subsidy of petrol. We're fighting over food. We're fighting, over so many things. We're thinking about minimum wage. People are saying we don't have the money. The government is saying that we can't afford this or that. So now you're saying that whatever we were paying for vaccinations in the next few years, we're going to have to increase it because we will no longer get subsidy. So that's an immediate challenge. So you have to think of very smart, innovative financing mechanisms uh, that will help us to win ourselves over from from the subsidy that we've been enjoying from Gavi, as it were. And that takes us to a critical matter, which is that you then start thinking about local production of vaccines. There was a lot of noise around it in 2020 when COVID came around. But since then, 2020 till now, what really have we done? So, just like oil, as I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, just like we have in the oil industry, the moment you start talking of self-sufficiency, you must control a substantial part, if not all, of that system, meaning that production, because if we have to pay more, we're going to pay more, not in Naira, but in dollars. So that also immediately creates a problem for the country. The fact that we'll have to look for more forex to pay for the vaccines, as it were. But what happens if we can produce locally is that our forex exposure is reduced. So that becomes an immediate challenge, which is that as we move towards this self-sufficiency, how do we ensure we can produce vaccines on our own sustainably? And which vaccines do we start with? Which vaccines do we add on? What's going to be our plan over the next several years to produce which vaccines, which ones will be worth the while for us to invest in and produce? Would we push for private investment in production? And how would we encourage all of those things? How do we guarantee the private investors of the market? How do we guarantee them of an environment that works? Manufacturing is challenged because of electricity. How do we guarantee electricity supply? So the problem goes way beyond the Minister of Health, and it's going to span, into many sectors and many sectoral considerations. But really, we'll have to think about self-sufficiency, not just in terms of money directly, but also in terms of production. Thank you.
The Gavi Vaccine Alliance has been a public-private partnership to help African countries with access to vaccines. Now, if this is changing, or it's going to change, so that African leaders can now play the key roles that they should in terms of funding and making the vaccines available, do you have fears as to the implications?
Well, I think those are some of the pairs I mentioned. To Gavi's credit, Gavi's plan had always been that the subsidy um, to the tune to which you are a low, what do you call it, a low economic society. So if you are not a high GDP society, Gavi subsidizes you more. So and the intention is that as your GDP increases, then you begin to enjoy less and less subsidy until you become self-sufficient. So it's a great thing that now we are saying by ourselves, 9 countries at least in Africa are saying by themselves, we have taken the bull by the horns. We are going to go for self-sufficiency very quickly now, and all of that. That is great. But the challenge is, just like I said, even in Gavi's own plan, strategic plan, it is tied to your economic development. So it means that whatever we have said we want to do in terms of vaccination is tied to being able to develop economically as a country. Now, I think that is a rhetoric that every government has been talking about for decades. And okay, since our new democracy in 1999, every successive government has talked about, we'll have economic development. And we went up at some point, we became supposedly the largest economy in Africa. Now we've fallen to the ground again, So we can't afford this yo-yo economics anymore. That's what it means. So it means that for us to achieve what this Abidjan Declaration is saying, the big fear is that we have to be able to achieve our economic goals. There's no winning if we cannot achieve the economic goals. So my fear is that it's out of, it's out of the hands of the Ministry of Health alone. The Ministry of Health has said something, but I'm hoping that everybody realizes the gravity on every sector, and the fact that we must all put our acts together, and particularly this our rhetoric about economic development must become a reality. Thank you.
If I had to take it from there, it feels as though that, from your postulation, that everything is interconnected, the health, the economy, the banking sector. Yes, I can not help but agree with you in that regard. Apart from the fact that we receive funds from donor agency partners, governments in the West, there's also been this, in quote, ideology, that drugs from the West, I'm trying, for want of words, better, right? People would say, oh, they prefer from this particular organization, or they prefer this brand of products. It's more, you can trust that this would give you the desired results. Trying to, fund immunization, is there any plan? Are we looking towards, as a country, as a continent, having to produce what we need right here? As regards syringes, injections, the drug proper to be administered to kids who require them right here. Do we have those things in place? Because, yes, it's one thing not to have the money, but then if we're producing locally, wouldn't that help, in the long run?
Well, it would, absolutely it would. And actually, I mentioned that earlier, but you have actually also touched on, one or two other things. The first one, so as we talk about this local production and self-sufficiency, you have mentioned things, it has tentacles, and one of the tentacles you mentioned was the social aspects of these things. People believing in something important being better. I agree with you. Some people believe that. But incidentally, where vaccinations are also concerned, we have had the opposite to be true. We've had it with polio vaccines, where somewhere in the north, people came against it very seriously and said this was being used to sterilize people. And a lot of clerics came out and spoke, but not a lot. Some clerics came out and spoke against it. However, they were believed. And for a while, polio campaign, eradication campaign was stalled, especially in the north, because people refused to have their children take it. So that was a social problem. It needed a different set of experts. So here we had the vaccines to use, but people were not receiving them. People refused to take them. Okay, and partly also because it was coming from abroad. We had a similar problem with COVID-19. There were also talks of what it is, what it contains, what it will do, and all of that. And again, people were worried because it was coming from abroad. There were videos that showed people supposedly discussing and saying, hey, let's go test it in Africans, and all of that. And these things went viral. And people were suspicious of things that came from abroad. So really, local production helps you. And actually, it extends to drugs, like you say. Some people believe that the foreign drugs are better, but honestly, some also believe that the local ones are preferred. Why? Because we have a lot of fake drugs, and some of these fake drugs are actually being faked from abroad. So when people go India, China, they produce the drugs. They produce with less quantity of what it should contain, and they import it in here and sell to people. But then when you have factories that produce here, it's easier to control what is coming in. or what they are doing, because once you can pick a defective batch of their drugs, you know where they are, you know which factory it is, you can easily go to them. But once you have a problem with a drug that was imported, where do you go? Do you fly to India? Do you go and fight them in India? How do you take it off? It's more complicated than that. So the local production in terms of acceptability and all of that is a key factor for us in improving our vaccine coverage. It will easily take care of some of the misinformation and disinformation that we deal with, because people will know this is being produced in Nigeria by Nigerians, and it generates more confidence, okay, as it were. You also then spoke about, some of these other aspects, because it's not just the vaccine. Okay, so like I said, if you're going to talk about self-sufficiency, you talk about taking control of the system around it, most of it and possibly all of it. Now, what I mean by that is that you talk about the vaccine production itself, but you start talking about some of the other things. So if you have a vaccine, you need syringes sometimes to administer them. So do we produce some of those things? Those are all things we have to start looking at. How do we encourage production in all of those areas? We had a syringe factory somewhere in the east, southeast, but I heard that closed down. I'm not sure if it's still closed or it's opened again. But all of those things are important, and we must ensure that we have an environment that enables investors in some of those fields to succeed and to succeed sustainably. Otherwise, our local or self-sufficiency would not work. So local production, again, Nigeria has talked about that for many years of vaccines. We've spoken about that for many years. We've had a public-private partnership with a private drug company in Nigeria, to produce and to start local production. Because again, many decades back, Nigeria was producing vaccines. So we were producing yellow fever vaccines, for instance, in Nigeria. For animals, for instance, we still produce in BOM, in Plateau State, we still produce vaccines. So the vaccine technology and production is not completely new to Nigeria or to Nigerians. Even though now that we've lost it for human vaccine production for many years, we will need expertise. We will need to train all kinds of levels of professionals in that technology. But we had the partnership. We went into partnership to say public-private partnership to say we needed this. And I think this must have been on for at least 10 years that we've had that partnership, but it has not taken off. Why not? Those are the questions we need to ask. Those are the things we need to probe. Because if we're serious, then we really need to make all of such things begin to work and begin to work now. That one is even, like I said, again, you produce one vaccine, maybe yellow fever or whatever, but then there are many vaccines that you could go into production. There are vaccines that you could have private investors decide that we're going to go into production of this particular vaccines and all that. There is all of that area. There are new vaccines being developed. So again, you must have a process that is very fair, that is very balanced, that is quite independent and professional, that looks at the need for vaccines and advises about the vaccine production or the new vaccines that Nigeria should be introducing. Because the fact that a vaccine exists doesn't mean that it is socio-economically viable for you to do or to produce in your country. So you have to have an independent team of experts that will examine all of the pros and cons and will advise and say, yes, Nigeria should produce this one. Yes, we should produce that one. No, we shouldn't do this one because it's not worth the while. The disease burden is too low. The cost of production will be so high that it's not really going to save us anything. It's better off we treat people, for that condition, or we give them drugs as chemo prevention. So there are many sides to it, like you said. I want to believe that many of the people who are talking on behalf of government and signing Abidjan Declaration have an idea of these issues and will take them seriously. Otherwise, it's just going to be one of those things that we sign internationally. Everybody makes noise about them and nothing happens. Thank you.
All right. Now, for a lot of things that you've talked about to happen, developing a robust healthcare system that not just involves only the production of the vaccines, but even the training of the healthcare workers, development of the cold chain systems and all. We need data as much as the willpower to drive this change. Now, beginning with data, how can Nigeria build a reliable database to know those who would need the vaccines before companies take up production, to know perhaps what are the issues that should be looked at before such investment? If we're talking about production of vaccines, so far in Africa, there are less than 10 companies with the ability for mass vaccines production. If partnerships are going to come in, then they will need certain kinds of information to help them. What is the role of the healthcare system in making this data available?
Well, the truth is, you're right about the need for data. Data is key to any successful government policy and policy implementation. So in fact, we talk about evidence-informed policy making as the bane or the foundation for development, meaning that you make your decisions based on data. You don't make decisions based on what you feel like, what you like, what you think it should be. So whether you're a National Assembly or you're in a ministry, you want to make laws, you want to make policies, you have to seek the data and you have to know where to get the data from. Okay, so at the end of the day, first bottom line truth is that the data exists, some data exists, okay? I would think that there's sufficient data actually to work with at the moment. We can always improve on our data systems, but we have data already that can be used, and data is already being used by some appropriately. We can always improve our data generation, you're right. And we live in a time and an age where the technologies are available that we can use. Okay, so we can get data right from from almost the smallest village because we have very good coverage, for instance, of mobile telephony. So it's easy for us to get people to send information. It's easy for you to look at a health post, give them a basic phone, and tell them, text us, how many cases of malaria you saw in this month, how many cases of measles you saw this month, suspected, even how many cases of, just send us a breakdown, just a text message at the end of the month. And you'll find that if we use those technologies, and use them appropriately and effectively, we can always improve our data system. It also means, but I think the bottom line of what we need some training in terms of improving our data management system. We need some training so that everybody, right from the top to the village health post, understands the value and the importance of data so that they don't take it for granted. Okay, so somebody doesn't just text you something, but he has forgotten or he didn't even bother to go check the records at the end of the month, or he didn't, or whatever. He just decides, I think it was 10 children with son. Yeah, I think it was 10, and he just sends you 10, but actually verifies that 10 before he texts it to you. Now, it also means that people taking records. You go to a hospital and they're writing your basic details and they write, name, age. Then you get to age. You don't say child or adult. They put an actual age there. He's 25 years old. He's 2 years old, because they now understand that all of that data is going to be quite useful, in determining the policies, in determining programs to implement, because we will have to look at it and say, what kind of people have been affected by X disease? Or it's mostly we have children under 5 that carry the burden of it. So let's introduce this there. Or we have a lot of people now who are under 40 developing this disease. What is going on? What do we do about it? How come we thought this disease was for older people? How come people under 40, more and more of them are getting it? So those are the kinds of decisions you make when you have data. So you train the people as well. You use the technologies. Of course, you ensure data integrity, which also means that you have a system of double checking sometimes. Sometimes it's just a spot check. So spontaneous, random spot check. These people are sending you data, but randomly you have some supervisors who just go into a place. They don't go every month or anything. They just decide, let's go to this one. They go there and they double check what was sent to them against the records there. All that puts everybody on their toes, that our data must be correct. Okay, so we have all of that, and then sometimes you look at data. Maybe this village sent this, the next village sent this. They're very close, and you're thinking to yourself, how come this guy says he's not seeing any malaria cases in 3 months, and this place is saying 50 cases a month, and they're next to each other. So those things again, somebody is looking at them and asking questions and say, let's go double check what's going on there, because it's not likely that this guy sees zero. When they're same people are coming to the health center, but the next person is seeing so many. So somebody goes and says, it looks suspicious. Let's go check what's going on there. So there are different ways to manage data and to create a data system. But first point I made is we have data already. Second point, it can be improved, and we can improve it by using the technologies available now. We improve it by training and retraining the staff we have, and then we of course implement a very worthwhile data management system which protects the integrity of the data that we actually use. Thank you.
Okay, so this conversation is supposed to be two parts. We're supposed to have a malaria aspect to it. But then I mentioned something earlier when I was having a conversation, Doc, with Blessing, and that's the fact that I have a problem with just 9 African countries, right, signing that agreement, that Abidjan Declaration. And we have, I don't have the number, 56 countries in Africa? 54 countries in Africa, and just 9 out of the lot signed that declaration. I mean, what does that portend? And how can we get more persons on board? Because if we all could, I mean, by all, I say Africa can pull resources together, can pull ideas, human capital and all that, we might be able to achieve more and push this issue of immunization, I mean, to a logical conclusion where we're self-reliant as a continent. So first and foremost, why is it just 9 African countries? I mean, can you speak to that? And then, what can be done to get more persons interested in immunization?
Well, again, you live alone and you die alone at the end of the day. We've spoken about some of the challenges of doing this and what it's tied to, being self-sufficient and all that. So really, on a good day, you have to decide by yourself what you think you can handle, and decide by yourself when you think you can handle it. Even when you had the African Continental Trade Agreement, Nigeria was about the last country to sign. Because we felt it wasn't for us, it wasn't going to work. So it's a personal decision at the end of the day that you have to just decide that you are not going to do this, or you are ready to do this, as it were. Africa generally, and then as you look at it, the African countries, not all African countries are receiving support from Gavi to start with, not all African countries. So we have countries that are not receiving for whatever reason, various reasons here and there. So those ones don't need to sign anything to start with. And there are countries also that you have a declaration. They may not politically, they may not see it as important to come and be signing the declaration, even though they may be working at the same thing and be determined to achieve the same thing. And the truth of the matter is some of them might actually achieve it before those who sign. So it just depends on how people rule or people want to run their countries. And so if they've decided we're going to get this done, we don't need to make noise about it, and we don't want it. It's almost like when countries choose to work with the IMF and the World Bank. on their economy. And some countries say, no, to hell with you, we're not interested. Sorry for the word, but they say we're not interested, even though we're going to work on our economy, and get our economy right. So it's a choice. I think it's not something we should worry about so much. All we should just worry about is are all African countries thinking about self-sufficiency? Are we all thinking about, standing up by ourselves? And one of the countries, for instance, which didn't sign this one, and yet is a country at the forefront, if you're talking about vaccine production, is one of the countries we'll have to deal with and talk about is South Africa. So I don't think it means that they're not interested in self-sufficiency. South Africa was already into COVID-19 production, vaccine production then, even though at the end of the day, this is Africa. No African country ordered COVID-19 vaccines from them. But they showed that this could happen and production could happen there. So we have to work together quite all right. But not everybody necessarily has to sign a declaration to make things work. Thank you.
About African countries, about 12 African countries so far have been able to roll out the malaria immunization program. So it's part of their routine immunization, the malaria vaccine. But in other countries, out of 54 African countries, about 12 of them have the malaria vaccine. In other countries in Africa, it is yet to happen. And a report says that the rate of malaria infections in Nigeria has dropped by 22%. Now that Nigeria is yet to have the malaria vaccine and start immunization on that, should we be rejoicing now that malaria infection has dropped by 22%, or there is more work to be done? And again, aside vaccination, what is the role of the Ministry of Environment in containing some of these diseases for which we immunize?
Okay, thank you. Let me start by correcting the data a little bit, which is that the malaria infection didn't drop by 22%. It dropped to 22%. And that's malaria prevalence, meaning that the occurrence of malaria people with infection per time, has dropped to 22% in Nigeria. But again, the interesting thing about that is that if we're reading the same sources, is that the data says that it dropped to 22% from 23%. Just 3, 4, I mean, how many years ago? So 23 to 22%. Yeah, but at least it didn't increase. So we thank God. So to start with, any downward look or downward trend is a good trend. Okay, so don't let's belittle the 1% drop, but it's not very high. The other good thing about it is what you mentioned, which is that it tells us that you can bring down the prevalence of malaria even without the vaccines. Okay, so we're not introducing vaccines. The reason why it came down was not because of malaria vaccines. So it tells us that there are already, some tools available, but if we were able to maximize them, we can really, really bring down the prevalence of malaria. So one of the things, for instance, that is being pushed and being done is chemo prevention during the rainy season. Yeah, that's just big terminology. It just means drug prevention of malaria during the rainy season. So you give children under 5 monthly treatment of malaria, whether presumptively treating, that is, you are assuming that they would have been infected with malaria, even though they are not sick yet, and you are trying to ensure that they don't get sick with malaria. Basically, you're trying to ensure they don't come down sick with malaria. So that means that they'll end up getting malaria treatment, as it were, monthly for about 3 months or so in the peak season, so around the rainy season. Okay, and that's just even drug prevention. We have the insecticide-treated nets, and then we have what you mentioned again, which is our environmental management of malaria, as it were. So we need to start looking at the fact that a lot of what happened in places around the world, including Europe, where malaria was eradicated. First of all, it was a different, they had some differences in terms of what we face. The malaria parasite that we deal with is one of the worst ones, the falciparum. The mosquitoes we are dealing with have a different lifestyle from what they primarily had that was carrying it around there. Okay, so there were some differences. However, the differences aside, the malaria prevalence was going down and down and down in some parts of the world, Asia, then okay, Europe, Asia, and all that. As development was happening, and now development, I'll take away, of course, it's economic development as well, but let's say it and let's call it environmental development, which goes along with economic development. So meaning that as the society developed and there were good roads, good drainages, there wasn't trash everywhere where water could collect and all that, then things began to improve. Okay, apart from whatever else, apart from treatment, and they didn't have malaria vaccine back then either. Okay, so it takes us to what you mentioned last, which is that we must also ensure that we start doing things right. The Ministry of Environment starts looking into things being done properly. Even the Ministry of Health, uh, in the past, we had people who were home or house inspectors who would go into the houses, go into the society. They look at it. They look at your house. They look at the fact that you had trash collected there. They're going to penalize you for it. Your waste disposal, your drainage that is dirty, not clean. They will raise issues with you, and you'll get penalized. Now, all of those things seem to have disappeared. We are no longer paying attention to those things. And those were things that existed in the past in Nigeria. So we need to look at it. The Ministry of Health, Ministry of Environment, even our what do you call it, Ministry of Roads, Works and Housing. We need to start looking at it. We are still building. We're still building even now. Even in some of our eyebrow areas, we're still building houses with open drainages in front of them, and then the drainage is only in front of the house that they built, and it's not flowing because nobody took time to connect it all the way down to the proper drainage around the place. Why? Because the developer says, I can only deal with this one. It's not my business to deal with all of our places. But what you did in front of that place, where is it going to flow to? And there's no local government to look into it and say, no, we have to make sure these things are connected and all these things flow very well. So there's a lot to be done. There's a lot to be done that goes beyond the Ministry of Health. So it involves other ministries. And we must understand that for us to curtail or deal with malaria, we can do it, but we'll have to attack it from many, many sides. Thank you.
I don't think I minced words when I said I am blessing. We're going to be picking your brain. Yes, you've been bringing a lot of insights to the conversation, Doctor. Yes, I wanted to ask you challenges, but somehow you were able to navigate through all of that, even proffering solutions in the process, in the middle, or in the mix of all you have said, in the last couple of minutes. But then I want to find out, as a professional, what's the role of the climate? Because, we have people from the West come to, the tropics here, and then you hear stuff like, I went to Africa and the mosquito, oh my goodness. And yes, we understand the impact or damaging impact mosquito has, killing a lot of people all over the world. But it feels like we adapt to it a lot more over here than, people who are in the temperate region. So what's the role of climate action in all of this? Yes, what's the impact of that? And how can we adapt accordingly to that?
Well, in terms of mosquitoes and malaria particularly, it thrives well in temperate environments, so warm, temperate climates like we have. So that's why we carry a high burden of that. But it will interest you because we say that temperatures are warming around the place. There are now cases reported of malaria in Europe. I think the last I read, if I remember correctly, I think was in France. and they couldn't find any travel history in that person. So that was a warning to them that, and that's what's predicted when you talk about climate change and health. That the places, if you talk of climate change in relation to global warming, what it portends for some of the colder regions of the world is that as they warm up, then they will start seeing certain diseases like malaria. They could start seeing them. So you could have a resurgence of some of those diseases that they eradicated because now the place is becoming more amenable, more comfortable for certain insects and organisms that that couldn't thrive in the cold temperatures. So for us in terms of malaria, it probably means that we're fine. You're right that it looks like we have adapted because once you're in a malaria high burden area like for us, we're exposed to it all of the time, meaning that as we're being bitten by these mosquitoes and the malaria parasite is being introduced, our body is producing its own resistance, its own immunity against it. So we have immunity. So we won't even have it. We even so many times I'm sure you go to work and you say, "Oh, I'm not feeling well, so what's wrong? I think I have malaria." But you're still at work, because you have immunity that seems to be able to hold it down. You don't feel well, but not that unwell. So if you take somebody who's not had malaria for years, including Nigerians who have jackpot, and you bring them there, bring them back into the country, they've not been exposed to it. If they have a malaria infection, they can come down with very serious disease that could scare you. And you be thinking to yourself, is that malaria? Are they sure it's only malaria he has? How come he's that sick? It's because he's lost his immunity over time. Okay, so for us, it's a protective thing in a sense. The fact that we're always exposed means that our immunity is always being on the high against malaria, relatively. That's not necessarily a good thing because what you want is the malaria to be gone. Because despite your immunity, sometimes you come down with full blown malaria and you are well, you stay home, you have to take treatment. Sometimes the treatment itself really knocks you out. So we have all of those issues. But in terms of climate change, you start and malaria, you start worrying more for the colder places that may start becoming warmer. It means that they may start having diseases like malaria again.
All right, you've spoken
Thank you.
to how malaria is commonized, so people just trivialize it. Oh, it's just malaria, and sometimes that leads to self-medication when a person feels feverish and has some symptoms that they by themselves diagnose and say, oh, it's malaria. They just go over to the nearby pharmacy or a drugstore to get anti-malaria. Is that adding to the problem of malaria resistance and the ineffectiveness of malaria drugs that we see?
Absolutely. Because again, what it means is that if we do self-medication, you decide this is malaria by yourself, you go get some drugs and use them. It may not be malaria to start with, because how do you know it's malaria? You say, I have a fever, I have a headache, my body aches. Now, all those things you have mentioned can be caused by 101 other diseases, so you don't really know. But when you use the drug, and sometimes you use the drug and you feel a little better, and then you don't even complete your doses and all of that. And what you have done is expose the organisms, you know, in you and in the environment because we also excrete elements of drugs that we take. Okay, so you expose organisms to that drug unnecessarily, and sometimes you expose them to suboptimal doses that do not wipe them out in your system. Okay, and what the organisms also do is that they take that drug. It's like taking the sample of your drugs and say, see the weapons these human beings are using. They take it back to their own laboratory and say, guys, we need to wear bulletproof now. This is the new bullet, and then they change and put on new resistance, as we call them. So drug resistance to the drugs that you commonly use. Okay, so after a while, you use the drug and it looks like you are not getting well. And then you start saying, oh, is it not malaria? Then you go to the hospital, they test, it says malaria. Let's try another drug, let's try another drug, let's try another drug. But it's because there has been an overexposure to those particular drugs unnecessarily. As a matter of fact, the reason why the malaria vaccine development has been so elusive is because the malaria organism is an expert at putting on new bulletproofs. So the moment you think we have something that is working, and we this one now, once we give it, it will take care of malaria, the organism changes. So the organism is very adept to changing its outlook, its protective mechanisms to ensure that you cannot kill it easily. Okay, so we and that's why we moved from the single exposures, the single drug therapy to combination therapies. Because when you are using multiple, because all those drugs work in different ways. So once you're using multiple methods of attacking the organisms, it's more difficult for the organism to adapt to you and to adapt to developing resistance. But one of the primary ways to prevent resistance is to ensure that drug use is rational. And by rational, we mean that proper diagnosis is established and proper treatment is followed and followed to its conclusion. So a professional establishes the diagnosis properly and they put you on the appropriate treatment. And that treatment must be followed religiously and completed. You don't stop. They say take it for 3 days. You used it for 1.5 days. You are feeling good. You are jumping up again. Well, I'm feeling good now. I'm going out. And then you start forgetting to take the drug from then on. And you leave the remaining in the pack and forget it there. No, no. What you did was clear a bit of the organism. You left some of the organisms alive. So you left some of the enemy alive. And those enemies you left alive will go back home and say, these are samples of what they shot us with. What can we do about it? How do we ensure that next time this guy shoots us, this thing doesn't kill us? So that's how resistance is developed. You're right about that. Thank you.
I like the way you explained it, using things that people can relate to, the bulletproof analogy. Thank you so much, Doctor, for being on the show. We've been able to pick your brains, and we know that because your brain is quite large and there's so many things in it, we've not been able to exhaust it. But we'll find some other time to take some other aspect as it concerns immunization routine programs in Nigeria and Africa. Let's see what the development will be now that there's an agreement for African countries to spearhead the move. We'll come back to you on that other time. So we'll be speaking with the Executive Secretary of the Nigerian Academy of Science and former chairman of the Lagos chapter of the Association of Public Health Physicians of Nigeria, Dr. Oladoyin Odubanjo. Thank you for being on an exchange.
Thank you for having me. Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right, Blessing. I didn't want to bring this with the good doctor. The fact that, he had mentioned that most people here in the tropics could actually come down with malaria and you're muscling it. And,
yes.
You tell yourself, I'm not feeling it. But then there's another side to it. And that's the aspect of self-medication, right?
Everyone seems to be a doctor when it comes to malaria treatment.
You can't buy malaria drugs now, okay? And these things are over the counter. They come without prescription. And in Igbo, you're just throwing into
even when they come with prescription, how many people take the time? Because they're so used to treating for malaria that they're used to it. So they know the dosage. It doesn't matter the brand. They tell you this one is how you take it.
Some of those that just have 3 doses that you take one a day are usually even preventive malaria drugs and not the curative, ones. Because from a medical expert, I learned that you have the preventive, you have the curative, and so the preventive may not be able to take all of, like he's saying, you just kill some and you let some go on and stuff like that.
That's for a pharmacist and a doctor to decide. But because people by themselves step into the roles of these professionals, so they can't differentiate which is for prevention, which is for treatment. They just go and all they ask, give me anti-malaria. And sometimes when you go to some drugstore, you find people who are not core professionals. They learned it like a trade. What they learned is how to sell. So when someone comes, they say this, they say that, you give them this, you give them that. So they just pick anything and give to you. But if you get a chance of interacting with a pharmacist, sometimes they tell you these things, have you taken a test? Have you done this? Do you have symptoms like this? Or perhaps you should try this. What kind of a brand have you been using over the years? They give you such counsel, but until you seek the service of an expert, you may not know what to do. So this is all saying the self-medication is not the best way to go, even with malaria, as common as it may be or it sounds, because some persons, by doing that, have just signed your death warrant, and it was never a pleasant story to tell. So leave diagnosis for doctors, leave treatment for doctors. That's why there are hospitals.
Early exchange, shaping policy, advancing development.